All right, in 3.5, we're going to look at sampling and surveys. Okay, it's continuing our conversation on how to get a good sample. So even when samples are selected at random, there are some potential sources of bias in the survey. Okay, some things can happen. Undercoverage occurs when some members of the population are less likely to be chosen or cannot be chosen for the sample. Undercoverage leads to a bias when the uncovered individuals differ from the population in ways that affect their responses. All right, so it's like somehow inadvertently left out a pocket of the population. So you've undercovered a certain group of people. And this can often happen, just make yourself note, this often happens with the convenience sample. But it can happen even with a simple random sample. It can happen. But especially happens with the convenience sample that we talked about before. Now, even if every member of the population is equally likely to be selected, not all members of the population are equally likely to provide a response. Okay, there's a big difference between being selected and actually responding. You should know that. Non-response occurs when an individual chosen for the sample can't be contacted or refuses to participate. They may just say no thanks. Non-response leads to bias when the individuals who can't be contacted or refuse to participate would respond differently than those who do participate. Non-response can only occur after a sample has been selected. For instance, in a voluntary response sample, every individual has opted to take part, so there is no non-response. Every person has asked to do it. When a researcher can avoid undercoverage and non-response, it is still possible for bias to affect the results. Characteristics of the interviewer, wording, respondents being truthful, untruthful, lack of anonymity, and many other factors can lead to a response bias. So this is kind of a catch-all. It's not non-response, it's not undercoverage, it's just a general, all these other things that can happen when there's a consistent pattern of inaccurate results. Okay, because the question's worded funny, they're being untruthful, they don't like their names attached to it, whatever. That's a response bias. So let's look at some examples. Suppose you want to know the average amount of money spent by the fans attending opening day for the Cleveland Indians baseball season. You get permission from the team's management to conduct a survey at the stadium, but they will not allow you to bother the fans in the club seating or the box seats because they're the most expensive. Using a random number generator, you select 500 seats from the rest of the stadium. During the game, you ask fans in those seats how much they spent that day. Describe how undercoverage might lead to bias in the survey, and explain the likely direction of the bias. Well, if you can only survey the people in a certain part of the stadium and you're leaving out the most expensive seat, then those people probably don't have as much money as those who do in the club seats or the box seats, right? So their average amount of money spent is probably going to be less than what those who spent in the club or box seats would spend, right? So the undercoverage is you're leaving out the more expensive or the big spenders. And so the direction of bias is that it's going to be actually less than it should be because you're leaving out the high spenders. Does that make sense? So how would I write this? I would say the fans in the club and the box seat can't be part sample. That's the undercoverage. That's the group of people who are being left out. Okay? These fans would likely spend more money at the game than the fans in the cheaper seats. So because of that, the estimate is going to be too low. Your estimate for the average amount spent will likely be too low. Okay? So it's a thinking question, and you got to write out your response. Let's try the next one. A survey of drivers began randomly sampling all the listed residential telephone numbers in the U.S. Of 45,956 calls to these numbers, 5,029 were actually completed. The goal of the survey was to estimate how far people drive. on average, per day. Describe how non-response might lead to bias in this study, and explain the direction of the bias. Well, they called people during the day. So let's think about this. There's a whole group of people who couldn't respond to this because they weren't available. They're calling residential telephone numbers. If they're driving around for work, they're not at home for the landline, so they can't respond. It's a non-response type of thing. They can't respond. So all those people who are driving, all that mileage that they're driving is not going to be included in the survey to figure out the average. So what's going to happen is people who are home don't drive very much, obviously. So that mileage that they get for the average is probably going to be too low. All right, so let's put this in words. This survey will yield a biased result because people who drive more miles per day are less likely to be at home to respond to the survey. Okay, so what direction is this going to be? It's going to make it too low. This will likely produce an estimate for the average distance or average driving miles. That's too low. Right? So that's how I'd answer that question. Last one. A study in El Paso, Texas, looked at seatbelt use by drivers. Drivers were observed at randomly chosen convenience stores. As they left their cars, they were invited to answer questions that included questions about seatbelt use. In all, 75% said that they always used their seatbelt, yet only 61% were wearing their seatbelts when they pulled into the store or parking lot. Explain why the two percentages are so different. All right? Well, that's probably because some of the people lied. You know, they may not have worn it, but when they were asked face to face, they probably lied and said that seatbelts are pretty important to them. So that is an example of a response bias. Okay, it's not undercoverage, it's not non-response, it's just response bias because they didn't tell the truth. Okay, so let's put this in words. People likely claimed to wear their seatbelts because they know they should. Okay? They are embarrassed to say that they do not always wear their seatbelt. Okay? So this is an untruth kind of situation. You don't have to tell me this, but that means it's just a generic response bias. Not non-response, and it's not undercoverage, it's just general response bias. Okay? So that gives you an idea of what we're doing in this section. We're talking about different types of bias and how they can happen. Your goal is to be able to identify it and to tell me what direction it's going to move your information, which way it's going to mess things up. All right? We'll talk more about this in class.